Welcome back everyone. Sorry I've been away for such a long time. I've been working on my Dracula's Reader's Guide and doing other things, and so I've just been quite busy. But some good news, the Dracula's Reader's Guide, for those of you that are interested, will be starting on the channel in the next few weeks. But in the meantime, I just wanted to come back and do a nice, easy video. And since in my Q&A video, some people mentioned the alphabet tag and me carrying on the alphabet tag, I thought I would continue the tag today. For those of you who don't know, the alphabet tag is inspired by a booktuber called Jim's Books and Stuff. I think he's the first person to have done this tag, or at least it's where I found it. And basically there is an episode for each letter, and for each letter there are roughly 10 questions, and I go through and answer those questions. Some of the questions are from Jim's channel, some ones that I've made up myself. And now, after a long break of not doing any videos for a while, and also not doing these tag videos for a while, let's carry on with G. And now, starting with the question that I always open with for these videos, G is for finish this word with your favourite author. So I actually didn't have many choices for G when I looked up the amount of G authors that I read on my Goodreads, which is where I keep track of most of my reading. I found that actually there wasn't all that much, but I did find Goethe as someone that I've read whose name begins with G, and I'm happy to say that Goethe is my favourite author whose name begins with G, and it's not just because he's the only one, he is also a very good writer independently of that. The first thing I read of Goethe's was Faust Part 1 for a book club, and I was completely blown away by it. I was surprised that it was a script. I didn't actually know anything about Faust aside from the general story going in, so it was interesting to see that that's what it was, or that's how it was told. I thought it was a really engaging story. Goethe actually has quite a good sense of humour that carries through to this day. The story, of course, of Faust is one of those timeless stories as well. I haven't read Faust Part 2, but I really should. I don't know why it hasn't ended up on my reading list, but that's something that I definitely need to get round to. But what I did read and really enjoyed was The Sorrows of Young Werther. This, I think, was Goethe's first or one of his early novels, and actually created quite a sensation and quite a mania in its time. It was actually a novel that was blamed for a lot of suicides in Goethe's time. Kind of like today, how when a horror film comes out, people will blame the horror film on a violent crime that happens. It seemed like a similar thing happened with The Sorrows of Young Werther, and it did certainly have quite a fan base. The story is about a young, weak, pasty boy called Werther who falls in love with someone. The love is unrequited. He's quite a depressive type. It's told through his letters, and it ends quite tragically. And at the time, there were massive fans of this book. Apparently there was young Werther merchandise, all kinds of stuff, people writing, their own fan fiction about this. It was quite amazing to read up on this and realise that the kinds of things that we talk about now about fan fiction, about crazy fans, and the influence of media are things that have always happened. And so this story just has a great kind of story around it as well. It's also quite a short novel, so if you wanted to dip into Goethe and just try something out, it's worth a go. It's quite different from Faust, so if you don't like it, you should still read Faust, but they're both really good novels and I can't recommend them enough. G is for Germany. Name the books by your favourite authors from Germany. Well, since I've already said Goethe, I'm not just going to be boring and pick him again, although of course Faust would probably be there. I don't know if Young Werther would be there. I do like the book, I don't know if it's my favourite of all time. But outside of Goethe, I would say that Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, probably one of my favourite reads of all time. I think that's a fascinating story. The character of Steppenwolf, someone with this identity crisis, it's quite a relevant story to our times today when topics of identity are quite prominent in society, and what does identity mean for people? Do we have a stable identity over time, or are we all just kind of, bits and fragments of contradicting personalities? It's a really fun story, it's very engagingly told, and got lots of interesting themes in it. I also really enjoyed Thomas Mann. A friend of mine bought me a collection of his short stories. It contained The Death in Venice, but it also contained other short stories of his that I really enjoyed. And I almost bought one of his books in a bookshop the other day. I can't remember which one it was, and the blurb really engaged me, and I think the only reason why I didn't is because I just didn't want to spend the money on it. But I think I should go back and buy that book at some point and give it a read, because I think there's a lot more to Thomas Mann than just Death in Venice and those short stories, and I really want to give them a try. G is for grimdark. What are your opinions on the grimdark fantasy subgenre? Well, for me, I actually have mixed feelings about this as a subgenre. I think as an avenue to explore, it's worth doing, just like any avenue, more or less, in fiction, is worth exploring. But I do think there are some kind of tropes or things surrounding grimdark that do irritate me a little bit. The main one is to do with the association with grimdark and realism, and this idea that grimdark is somehow more real than, say, a fantasy that's a bit more whimsical or comical or something. And I think this just comes down to a personality thing, but I just find that that approach and the outlook that's often developed in grimdark is an incredibly cynical, nihilistic approach that actually I don't find to be very realistic. I find it to be a bit over the top and silly at times. That's not to say that life can't be brutal at times, it certainly can, but life also has its ups, it has its great moments. As an example of something that has elements of grimdark but maybe isn't all the way, I would actually say The Lies of Locke Lamora is quite good, because it has elements of that darkness, it has some pretty brutal death scenes, some, just brutal stuff in general. The characters are morally ambiguous, the main characters that is. So there's all those elements of grimdark, but at the same time, Scott Lynch has a good amount of humour in his characters and his stories, and there's enough light within the shade to make a balanced story. So I think ultimately for me with grimdark, it's a question of how far are we going? I find that something that is just too cynical and too depressing just kind of becomes a bit monotonous to me. I don't find that especially interesting. I think sometimes it can devolve into almost shock value, like, look how gritty my novel is, look how gnarly this death scene was, as opposed to maybe trying to tell a compelling story outside of shocking people. But grimdark, like I say, can be done very well, like any genre. And I think when grimdark is done really well, like in The Lies of Locke Lamora, for example, I think it can be great. That being said, I think as a whole, as a subgenre, it's not one that I would put up as my favourite. I enjoy it to some extent, but it's just not my favourite subgenre. And I think maybe it's a bit overdone in today's kind of contemporary fantasy scene. And it'd be nice to see more positive fantasy novels getting a bit more mainstream attention, in my view anyway. There's a bit too much darkness in the world, let's just have some fun. Carrying on with the gruesome theme here, we have G is for gruesome. Name some of the most gruesome texts you have ever read. Well, obviously I've read the Marquis de Sade, so all of his books are going to go on the list. But I've talked about Sade a lot on the channel, so I wanted to spotlight some other books here. I think as an example from the horror genre, anything by Clive Barker, but especially his books of blood. This is a collection of horror short stories that pretty much has any type of gore you can imagine. It has body horror. There's one story about this woman who can change the shape of things with her mind, and she uses this to some pretty gruesome effects on some of the men in her life. There's a story about two cities that have this competition every year where every member of the city ties themselves to the other member of the city and become this huge giant thing that, and they fight in this, this giant city guise, and one of the cities breaks and all of the people start crushing each other and everyone goes crazy. There's a story about a pig, a possessed pig, that starts causing havoc in a prison. There's all kinds of gore, all kinds of gruesomeness in these stories, and they're also just fantastically written. I think Clive Barker, in some sense, at least his horror films have, they've got a pretty good reputation, but I do think his horror writing is a bit underrated, especially when compared to the likes of Stephen King. I think Barker should definitely be up there with King, if not, maybe, in my opinion, a little bit better than King as well. G is for genre. What are some of your favourite genres of fiction? Back in the day, I would definitely have said this would have been fantasy, with no question, or maybe horror to some extent too, but probably fantasy. Although I have found that recently my love of fantasy has dwindled a little bit. It's not that I don't like it anymore, I still do like it. I still get a lot of enjoyment from fantasy books, but I have been reading just a lot more classics recently, and that's where my interests are generally lying now. But I don't also see classics as necessarily a genre, because obviously they cover a lot of ground. So it's hard to really pinpoint exactly what my genre is. I think maybe I like romantic novels the best. Things like Wuthering Heights, the kind of Victorian novels I really enjoy. That period, I think, is just my favourite period of writing. But in general, I like romantic novels. I like novels that have these themes about nature and society and the conflicts between the two. Those are sorts of things that I enjoy. I don't know if that's especially a genre per se, but it is what I tend to gravitate towards. Another genre or movement in literature that I've gotten into more recently is modernism, which is a genre that I used to hate early on in my reading life. I couldn't stand the likes of Virginia Woolf. I thought it was ridiculous. And then, as I've said before, I've reread most of Woolf's stuff and I really enjoy them now. I really enjoy Joyce. I recently read Nabokov's Ada, which I suppose maybe is more postmodern, but it kind of in that sort of style. And all of this stuff I just wouldn't have entertained once upon a time, but now it's a genre that I'm finding I actually have a lot more time for. Sometimes it can be a bit annoying, sometimes it can be a bit hard, and sometimes you wonder if maybe the author is just being a bit of a smart ass. But nevertheless, when you kind of persevere and you don't take it too seriously, I think there's always a tendency with like postmodern literature and modernist literature to take it really seriously and take it as, you know, to some extent you should, but it's also a book. You should just try and enjoy it, let it wash over you. And I actually find that generally helps you enjoy the book a lot more as well. So modernism, I would say at the minute at least, it's a genre that I have found a new love for. And in general, I just say I'm pretty open to most genres. There's not many genres that I would say I dislike and wouldn't read at all. G is for Goodreads. What do you think of Goodreads, and do you use it? And how many books have you read? And do you use a reader's challenge? Well, I do use Goodreads. I think it's quite useful just for tracking the books that I read. I do also have a reading challenge. I try and set myself a certain amount of books every year. Sometimes I hit it, sometimes I don't. This year I'm trying 80 books. Last year I tried 80 books and I didn't hit the target, but that doesn't really matter. I don't really see these things as necessarily things that I should be striving towards. It's just that if you set yourself a goal, even if it's overly ambitious, it just gives you a motivation sometimes to read when you otherwise might not. So I find that quite useful. I also like to keep track of the things that I've read, because especially having this BookTube channel, you know, if I'm doing a video like this, it's much easier to just search on Goodreads, you know, how many G authors have I read, so I can actually see. And I've pretty much, I think, got most of the major books that I've read on there. So it's quite a good source for me to use for stuff like that. As for a website, I guess it can be quite clunky. I do find it annoying that the app version and the web page version don't really map up very well together, and so to do something on one can be quite difficult to do on the other, and so that can be annoying. But you know, I think it's somewhat useful as a thing. I use it for my channel, I use it for keeping track of things, so I don't really have much of a problem with it. G is for greatness. What are some of the greatest novels that you've ever read? Well, I tend to associate greatness with not necessarily the novels that I've enjoyed the most, because then I might have to include something like Flowers in the Attic, which, you know, I got a lot of pleasure from reading that, but I'm not sure I'd say it's the greatest work, you know, of all time. So I think there is like a balance here of sort of maybe preference and some objective aesthetic qualities that I understand that they exist even if I can't articulate them. And on that basis, I'm just going to go with, rather than thinking of something or a list of them, I'm just going to go with the thing that I've recently read and I'm finding a whole new appreciation for, and that is the Iliad by Homer. So I read the Iliad and the Odyssey a couple of years ago now as part of a book club. I got the Odyssey first time in the sense of the story engaged me, I enjoyed it, I thought it was great. I read the Iliad and it just went over my head in the sense that if you read it and you just try and read it, you know, not all in one sitting, but, you know, in a short-ish space of time, say over a month, and you're reading, say, you know, 3 or 4 books of the Iliad at a time, it can just feel like one long, relentless battle scene with lots of gore and blood and violence, which is fine, but obviously this is meant to be a great work, and so you're like, well, why is this so great then? And so when I first read it, I got some enjoyment out of it, but I did think, this is too long, there's too much war and not enough interesting stuff going on. And now I have decided to reread it, and rather than trying to read it in a month and reading multiple chapters at a time, whenever I pick it up, I just read one book slowly and pay attention to what's going on in the various books. And in doing that, I'm actually realizing there's way more going on here than just fight scenes. Yes, almost every book has a fight scene, but it also has other stuff going on. It also has moral messages, moral debates, stuff about the gods, all this stuff going on, and even really boring books. So the first time I read the Iliad, I think it's the second book, you just have this big long list of all of the men, I think on both sides, but mainly focusing on the Greeks, who are going, who are involved in this battle. And it describes, you know, in each stanza you'll have maybe a description of one man, what he does, where he came from, and his home life. And, you know, when you're reading this, it's like, you know, when you read bits of the Bible and it just tells you about who begat who, and then someone begat this someone, and it's really tedious. It's a bit like that. And so when I first read the Iliad, I was like, this is just really boring. How could this be entertaining? But then, rereading it this time, and thinking about, well, why is that there? Why are we learning about all of these, to some extent, faceless men? And it's because Homer wants us to understand the lives of these people going into battle. You know, in a film, you just focus on, you know, modern film, you just focus on the main characters, and all of the other people in the battle are just faceless extras who, you know, if they're lucky, they'll get like a cool bloody death scene, but, you know, they're probably not going to have any words, they probably won't have a name, they're just, you know, nameless nothings. Whereas in the Iliad, you have this focus on, I'm going to tell you in detail, you know, where these men came from, whether they were a farmer or a blacksmith or whatever it is. I don't know if they had blacksmith. Yeah, they will have a blacksmith back then. Whatever they were, and how great they were, you know, as an archer, and all this stuff. And then throughout the rest of the story, you're going to see these people die. And so for every single death, there's a face. And I think that actually is quite impactful. And when I realised that that was going on, I appreciated that scene a lot more. And I appreciated that with a lot of the Iliad that I've read so far. I've not quite finished it, but just taking it slowly and thinking about it in a lot more depth than I did the first time, and I'm just blown away by it. So yes, that's my answer for what I think is currently the greatest novel. Maybe not very original, but you know, there's a reason why people put it up high, and I'm glad that I've given it the chance and realised why people do that. G is for Gothic. What is the greatest Gothic novel? Well, it's going to have to be a toss-up between Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Gregory Lewis. Both of them have their own unique style of Gothic horror that they more or less invented. We have Radcliffe, who really pioneered the sublime Gothic terror genre, which focuses on psychological horror, the unknown. Doesn't really tend to have supernatural stuff in it. There's usually like a sense of the supernatural, but ultimately things turn out to be a lot more mundane. On the other hand, we have Matthew Gregory Lewis and his famous novel, The Monk, which focuses on the horror type of Gothic, which is, you know, the more modern style, really, in the sense that it focuses a lot on the visuals. There's usually supernatural stuff, there's demons, all that kind of, you know, visual horror that we see all the way up to Dracula and beyond. But I think both of these are greats in the genre. I think, to some extent, I do have a slight preference for Matthew Gregory Lewis, just because I find The Monk to be a little bit more engaging and subversive than Radcliffe's work. I especially like how the devil character who corrupts the monk, or in part corrupts the monk, he already seemed a bit like dodgy before this point, but, you know, when the devil comes, it's disguised initially as a boy, and the monk is attracted to this boy, which already kind of, you know, getting on some shaky ground there with the Catholic Church, and we have the boy then revealing itself as a woman. So you have a lot of stuff going on here with gender, with corruption in the church, and the fact that Matthew Gregory Lewis was willing to go there and explore those themes in a novel in the 1700s is amazing. That being said, Radcliffe's novels are also fantastic and in a league of their own. Her ability to describe nature is amazing. Her ability to come up with interesting plots, especially in the Italian, which I'd say is probably my favourite of her novels. I know The Mysteries of Udolpho usually gets touted as her best, but I do find that novel to be a bit bloated, and actually there's like a whole section at the end of the book where basically the action has been completed, you know, all the main stuff, and it's just a very long resolution, and it gets a bit, you know, tiresome towards the end. The Italian on the Radcliffe, the Italian on the other hand is a little bit more concise. It's a little bit more terrifying as well. So for me, that's the Radcliffe novel that I prefer, but I would recommend reading them both. But maybe start with the Italian just in case you get put off by The Mysteries of Udolpho. And I suppose maybe just looking ahead a little bit to my Dracula series, I'm going to also put Dracula in there because, you know, it's also a fantastic story and one that I have found new appreciation for by making this series and thinking about it. And one of the things that I'll talk about in some of the episodes is how I think what Stoker does really successfully in Dracula is he brings together the two kinds of horror that we see with Radcliffe and Lewis and just combines them in a new and interesting way. G is for Globe. What is the best production of a Shakespeare play you have ever seen? Well, there are two, I think, productions that immediately come to mind. Maybe three, but I think I'm going to stick with the two. Firstly, we have the production of Macbeth with Ian McKellen as Macbeth and Judi Dench as Lady Macbeth. I love this production, not only because of the obvious cast choices there, both of them do a great job in those roles, but also the production itself uses an incredibly minimalist set design where basically most of the characters are dressed in black the whole time. The stage is constantly black, darkly lit at best, and it just adds and really brings to the fore that Gothic sensibility that I think is just all over Macbeth. I think that's probably why I like Macbeth so much, because it has that Gothic element that I really appreciate. But yeah, it's a fantastic production, very well acted. It goes to show that you really can do a lot with a little as well. I'm always impressed by productions of not just Shakespeare, but anything, where they're able to capture something so well without relying on massive amounts of spectacle and, ooh, look at these costumes, or ooh, look at this set design and all that crap. Like, no, just give me the words, give me some great acting, that's all I need, you know? And I think that's what that production does really well. That being said, something that does use a little bit more spectacle is the BBC adaptations of Henry VI, which is in 3 parts, and usually lauded, well, not lauded so much, as one of Shakespeare's weakest plays, and certainly one of his weakest history plays. Now, I watched this production and I wasn't expecting much going into it. I was expecting this to be a slog. Each play is very long as well, and obviously they're not well regarded. And I think I can see why, to some extent, they're not very well regarded. This point in Shakespeare's career, he's still writing in a sort of Marlowe style, which means that his characters tend to go on these very long, obnoxious, and sometimes tiresome rants. And sometimes I do think that the only reason why these rants succeed in this production is because the acting is just so good that you actually forget to look at your watch. But I feel like if I was reading this rather than watching it being acted, I would be thinking to myself, this is just too long. This is too long-winded. This is ridiculous. But because the production has such great actors, especially the actress that plays Lady Margaret, me and my partner really enjoyed her. We thought she was great. And she appears in all 3 plays as well. And she does such a good job that she really brings that character, makes a lot out of that character, who actually, when we think about it a little bit, is probably a little bit one-dimensional. So that's a good example, because it's an example of a Shakespeare play that probably isn't one of Shakespeare's best, but it just goes to show that sometimes, with a good enough actor, and even with a bit of spectacle, you can bring something up a little bit. G is for girls. What are some of your favourite novels about girlhood? I think for this I'll go with an old book and a new book, just to give some balance. For the old book, I think I'm going to have to go with Charlotte Bronte, and I'm kind of torn between choosing Jane Eyre and Villette, because I think in a way these both have they both tell a very different story about a girl growing up and coming into her own. On the one hand, we have Jane Eyre, the more famous of the two, Jane being a kind of already, when she's a child, she's quite a strong-willed, extroverted persona, and she manages to keep that throughout the story, and she kind of struggles to maintain her sense of self and her identity and her strength in the face of men of power and other members of society as well. And ultimately she's able to do this, she's able to have a relationship with the man that she loves, but also maintain her sense of integrity. On the other hand, we have Lucy Snow from Villette, and we have a similar story where Lucy is trying to make her way through the world under the pressures of society, of men and women around her. But unlike Jane, Lucy is much more introverted and introspective. Most of the story is taking place within her mind, and it creates a very different story from Jane Eyre, which is a very, much more external kind of story, focusing on the life events and developments of Jane. And I think, in terms of the reading experience, Jane Eyre, it has a lot more to say for it in terms of being easier to get into and all of this. I actually gave up on Villette the first time I read it, but the second time I read it, it really just struck a chord with me, and it's a book that I'll read probably again and again. So, those things that it's hard to decide between these two, but they do represent two very different coming-of-age tales from Charlotte Bronte, and they're both worth reading and comparing. In terms of the new book I want to choose, I'm going to go with Donna Tartt's The Secret Friend. I don't understand why people rated this book, Donna Tartt's, so low in comparison to The Secret History. Yes, I understand that as a story, it's not what people would have expected from Tartt. It's very different. It's not a murder mystery, and she also sort of tricks the reader into thinking it's a murder mystery and then just goes somewhere else, and it just becomes this story about this young girl growing up and becoming a mature young woman. And I don't know, I found that quite clever that she was playing with what her audience were expecting, not in a demeaning or derogatory way like we find in almost any subversion of expectations these days, but just in a little playful way. And, she didn't just do it for cheap thrills. She just did it as a way to tell a compelling story about this girl. And Harriet, the protagonist, is a fascinating character. In fact, I would say that she's probably more complex than, Lucy Snow and Jane Eyre, at least because with those two we do see them growing up, so we get less time with them as, say, a child, whereas Harriet's a child throughout the whole story. So, yeah, definitely a book to reread if you read it the first time and didn't like it. I think, like I said, I just don't understand what the negativity is about this book. I think it's, You know, it might not be the same on the same level as Secret History, but it's certainly up there and it's certainly worth not skipping it. Alright, that is it for this tag video. Let me know how you would answer these questions. What do you think of my answers to these questions? I look forward to getting back and talking to you all in the comments about that. And I look forward to starting the Dracula's Reader's Guide series. I think there'll be maybe 6 or 7 episodes of this. I haven't written the scripts for the last couple of episodes yet, and I'm still deciding on that. But there'll be roughly that many episodes in total. So look forward to getting into those. But that's it for this video. So take care, everyone. Ta-ra.